Onto these shores, into this country, they came seeking social, political, and religious freedom. Freedom to worship in their own way, within their own belief, and hold on to the values that they were taught to cherish. In this house. In 1620, atop a windswept rock in Plymouth, Massachusetts, stood a small congregation of men and women whose faith had led them to these shores to start a new life. Almost 300 years later, another small group of men and women came to stand atop another hill at the far end of this expanding country they called America, and looked out over the lemon and orange groves of the small ranches that lay just north of the City of Angels, Los Angeles, California, to create a church that could stand as a testament to their faith. At the corner of Prospect and New Hampshire, in an area known as Prospect Place in East Hollywood, California, the foundation for a new building was being laid to form as the cornerstone for a new 4-room schoolhouse, and as a place where these people could gather together to learn the lessons handed down in the Bible. The Congregational Home Missionary Society of Southern California had recommended opening a Sunday school in this area of East Hollywood. Reverend H.P. Case, a Congregationalist minister and superintendent for the public school district, canvassed over 50 families for the needs of a new Sunday school in the community.
The preliminary work of organizing a Sunday school according to the following constitution was done. 4 classes were enrolled. A committee of Mrs. W.A. Caldwell, Mrs. J.M. Brack, and Mrs. Charles H. Connard was appointed to report next Sunday a list of officers and teachers. A committee on nominations reported, and the report was adopted as follows. For superintendent, Mr. D.A. Schweitzer.
After election of these officers, it was recorded that classes were taught, and the newly nominated Superintendent Schweitzer was introduced and made a short address, pledging himself to earnest effort in behalf of the Sunday school. School closed with a song and a prayer from the 34 people in attendance and 95 cents in the collection plate. Classes and church service continued at the small 4-room schoolhouse until September 17th, when the public school came back into session, and the congregation moved down the street to a vacant lot to continue learning the lessons of the gospel under a 20 by 30 foot tent they'd put up with borrowed cloth and lumber. It was in this temporary place of worship that the small gathering of people put forth a formal request to the United Congregational Churches to ask for a more permanent home and structure for their faith. And on October 17th, Reverend F.L. Newcomb held a series of sermons on the concepts of Congregationalism before this initially gathered group of 24 supporters.
The scriptures of the New Testament are to be accepted as revealing the will of Christ as to the faith and practices of his disciples, and nothing can be required in the organization and government of his church which is not directly contained in or plainly warranted by these scriptures. The principles of church government embodied in the scriptural teachings we hold to be as follows. The visible church universal is composed of all those who publicly confess their faith in Christ as their Savior and Lord. The seat of church power is not found in a single universal church government claiming authority, nor one which is national, provincial, diocesan, or synodical, but only local congregations, that is, churches of believers. These particular churches have all needful power of self-government under Christ, but are to be recognized communion and cooperation with each other. These two features, namely self-government in the local church and fellowship between all churches with privileges and obligations, are the cardinal features of the polity held by Congregationalists. The church thus constituted has power to make its own rules, select its own pastor, adopt its own form of worship, and manage its own affairs.
Managing to raise $10 a month, the church rented out a more permanent place of its own at the northeast corner of Prospect and Vermont, in a building owned by William Hoagie, the husband of church librarian Annetta Hoagie. And on October 26, 1906, the church was formally recognized in a specially convened ecclesiastical meeting to confirm the creation of this new church to be called the Mount Hollywood Congregational Church of East Hollywood, California. The church moved as well to make an offer to have their part-time minister, the Reverend Francis L. Newcomb, become their permanent pastor for the next year, at a salary which was not stipulated but stated to be in the recorded church minutes as the best we could do. The church also agreed that it would be best if the pastor could proceed with the publication of a manual on the church's doctrines, but to do so also at no expense to the church. An envelope system was adopted within the church for taking up collections, and the Congregational Home Missionary Society of New York finally gave the church grant monies in aid of $50 a month. And Pastor Newcomb made the printing of the manual profitable by putting in ads from local merchants and reminding the congregation in the weekly newsletter to please take their business to those who took out ads to aid our church. Advertising for new pastors seemed to be the business of the growing church for the next few years, as well as realizing that even a man of the cloth needs to make a material living. Although still hoping to find one whose material needs were far less than the spiritual ones, to be offered at their still small, struggling church.
Professor Colcord informs me that the Reverend Mr. Rich of Fairmont is to supply your service next Sunday. Mr. Rich is a talented preacher and will probably be able to serve the field for far less compensation than Mr. Newcomb could possibly get along with. Trusting everything will work out for the best, I'm very sincerely yours, Reverend John L. Mayle, Superintendent, Congregational Home Missionary Society of Southern California.
Dear brothers and sisters, your letter of April 16th extending to me a call to act as your pastors before me, wish hereby to express to you my acceptance of your offer for the time and terms mentioned.
Reverend A.C. Wright mentioned in his letter of May 29, 1907, in accepting the call to become pastor of the church for $75 a month. While the church itself was squeezing every last dollar, dime, nickel, and penny to purchase a piece of property next to their original meeting place at the small Los Feliz schoolhouse and incorporating their church on April 17, 1908. Mr. Julian Phelps loaned $400 for the down payment on the property, and 500 dime gleaners were bought for $15 and distributed throughout the congregation, which brought in an additional $32.80 towards the $1,700 needed for the lot. The church now also needed another pastor after receiving a letter from Reverend Wright announcing his resignation.
Dear brothers and sisters, I very much regret the necessity of offering to you my resignation as your pastor, but for reasons which I have already stated.
The ladies of the Church Supply Committee, whose apparent responsibilities included not only procuring chairs, Bibles, and other assorted supplies for the church, supplied the name of Reverend C. W. Hawkins from the nearby La Cañada Congregational Church to fill the pastorate. They also authorized the director of music to finally buy a piano for $138.87 and voted an additional $20 to purchase singing books as soon as the money became available. By 1911, the $20 became available to purchase 100 new copies of the Hymns of the Kingdom of God, and the Sunday school teacher made a report to the congregation that while
we possess songbooks, beginner's chairs, and a locker containing supplies and sundry items, all in good order. Now, as to what is necessary to make a good school is, first, be loyal. Second, work. Third, enthuse. It seems to me that in this respect, we lack in most departments. We are not alive to the situation and the possibilities. We are not enthusiastic.
the congregation was also less than enthusiastic in receiving the news that Reverend Hawkins had submitted his resignation to the church. And though the church was without a permanent pastor, they now had a permanent home in a new small building, affectionately known as the bungalow, completed on their newly purchased property earlier that year, in March of 1911. The church also completed their search in November for a new pastor, with Reverend H.O. Henderson from Valdez, Alaska, coming highly recommended as a candidate from the Washington State Conference of Churches in his fitness for their congregation. But ill health ended the pastorate of Reverend Henderson shortly after he came to Mount Hollywood, and the church was forced once again not only to find someone to lead them in worship, but the need for another place to worship, as the Los Feliz Elementary School was expanded to accommodate a growing student population in this area of East Hollywood. And so the school district moved to take over their property and place of worship as a temporary schoolhouse for their pupils. And so the congregation soon found itself meeting back at Hoagie Hall and the newly remodeled schoolhouse, where it all began less than 5 years ago.
It will be through our faith and not financial gains that this church will grow,
Announced Dr. Frank Roselot when he accepted the pastorate position at Mount Hollywood Congregational in 1913. Church board member and Los Angeles City Superintendent Dr. Ken Gott suggested that the new pastor go out into the community with the congregation and help solicit funds.
We should do the work and then ask help,
Replied the new pastor. By 1914, the congregation had grown enough in size and finances to move into a newly constructed church cottage on the corner of Prospect and Hastings, with the first monies given towards the new building fund in the coffers coming from Sunday school student Robert Phelps. Apparently, having learned the lessons handed down in Sunday school that it is better to give than to receive, lessons from which the entire congregation would come to learn as well. As the adult classes of Sunday school were now being taught the same uniform lessons based on the biblical stories that the children were learning. Lessons of love, caring, and compassion that the entire world, it seemed, could be learning as well.
I am writing these lines after the greatest test of faith and anxiety it has ever been mine to experience. And may I, or any of my friends, ever be called to pass through such torture of heart and mind,
Wrote Pastor F.P. Roselot to the congregation as his son lay close to death from the infantile paralysis that had come to claim his only boy and so many others early on in this century. Testing not only a practiced faith in God for these believers, but their faith in the medical practices of that period. Perhaps it was through God's grace and the insistence of the Public Health Service Director that this church had been founded in the only schoolhouse in Los Angeles with a sanitary drinking fountain to help prevent the spread of disease. Now the pastor and congregation also had insistence in the faith that God would see their pastor and his son through what so many would struggle with early on in this century.
it now seems that God in his goodness shall spare me my only son, that I love as my own life, if not better than my life. God is good, and my heart overflows with gratitude. I'm hoping to be with you next Sunday, and shall trust it may be so. Meanwhile, I shall sit by the side of my wounded son and think and pray for you all.
A grateful church bid goodbye to Dr. Roselot in October of 1915 with praise for his pastorate, and also offer prayerful thanks to him and his family who were taking time to cope with their now recovering son. As the church, this country, and the entire world were trying to cope with these uncertain times.
Sensing the needs of the church and community as well as I could, my first endeavor has been to bring the church to the notice of the community and city where money, brains, and religion are being given to the service of God and humanity,
Announced the new minister, Reverend Clyde Sheldon Shepherd, as he came to Mount Hollywood with his family in 1915 from Belvedere Methodist in Los Angeles.
I am persuaded we must convince this community that we are alive and earnest and that we know how to do things.
But what to do about the creative community that was right down the road from the church was another matter, as the movie industry took over the town of Hollywood.
A constant challenge are the unchurched members of the theatrical profession who dwell among us.
It was volunteered that all members of the congregation after the service one Sunday would walk down the street to appear in a Vitagraph Pictures movie, where they would be cast as the congregation in a church service scene, and perhaps thereby spread the message to those theatrically unchurched community of actors and others that it was Jesus who acted out of love and compassion for them. But a disappointed pastor reported to the congregation in the next weekly news bulletin that
we must acknowledge ourselves narrow of vision or weak of purpose. The majority of the motion picture industry are untouched. But we should also gratefully acknowledge the grand sum of $100 from Vitagraph Pictures for our efforts in this biblical work.
But as disheartening as it was for anyone not to hear the message of love that God has given to them, the pastor explained that
we have reason to lift our hearts in gratitude and praise to our Lord and Master for His guidance in the extremely difficult task of erecting a house of worship in perfect accord of our congregation.
as the $100 made interacting with those unchurched actors and others at Vitagraph Motion Pictures helped to pay for the laying of a cornerstone for the new church foundation. The new church was dedicated November 15, 1915, with a Bible, church records, and a daily paper being placed within a box in the cornerstone of the foundation for their church, Mount Hollywood Congregational.
The cornerstone for any church is built upon the teachings of Jesus, based upon the Bible.
Believed the Reverend Ryland, minister of the First Methodist Church in Hollywood. But when his Methodist Church Council voted to support the United States' entry into the war in Europe, he could not condone the council ignoring God's commandment that thou shalt not kill.
Through the years, there has come to men the strong command from his lips, follow me, accept my way, trust in the power of love, love even your enemies, do good to them that hate you, follow me even if it leads you also to the cross.
He resigned his pastorate and position as district superintendent for the Los Angeles area Methodist Church and came to Mount Hollywood, along with a large number of his Methodist Church congregation, some of whom had originally founded the church they had just left, but found even more their faith had been shaken by the lack of peaceful prospects for this world and in their former house of worship before coming to Mount Hollywood.
The life of this church view from the standpoint of a willingness to serve and of devotion to duty has made a growth that should be termed a revival,
announced the outgoing Pastor Shepherd in the church newsletter, as he welcomed Reverend Ryland to the pulpit at Mount Hollywood, along with the 96 new members from the Methodist Church.
It was a happy day for us at Mount Hollywood when our dearly beloved Dr. Ryland became our pastor, and his family and many friends joined with us in our work,
said Mrs. Searles, a founding member of Mount Hollywood. She also found it took a bit of work and understanding before the Methodists would stop shouting a fervent amen after sermons delivered by Reverend Ryland at Mount Hollywood in praise to the pastor and the Lord. On May 1st, 1920, an overflow crowd and congregation gathered as ground was finally broken for the building of a new church sanctuary, and the cornerstone was laid after church services on Sunday, August 1st, before a congregation that now had come to total 384 men, women, and children.
With it, we dedicate our lives anew to the great work which we all enjoy.
Recorded the church clerk, James Ward Sr., from the minutes of the morning as Reverend Ryland spoke on that special Sabbath.
As we hear the all-important message from our beloved pastor, one can't help but wish that our auditorium was 4 times as large so that many others could come and enjoy this great privilege that is ours.
In 1921, a special announcement was made in the church newsletter that our church
will be dedicated on Sunday, January 23rd at 11 o'clock. On Thursday afternoon and evening, a council of churches will meet to install Dr. Ryland as our pastor. Let us look forward to and plan for a great week.
The church now held a privileged place in this area known formally as Prospect Park. As the community west of Vermont and north of Franklin, that was originally the country estate of Broadway department stores founder Arthur Letts, was opened up to more families moving into the new homes which had been constructed. As the congregation of Mount Hollywood grew to well over 600 people, the little church sanctuary that Clerk James Ward had wished could seat 4 times as many people became the predominant place of worship and community church for all those in the area now known as Los Feliz Square. A young men's and boys club was formed under the guidance of Mr. Rapage, who owned the hardware store on Hollywood Boulevard, which the YMCA held up as a model and the best organized boys' work in Hollywood. Men organized the Brotherhood Club, holding Sunday evening forums at the church to discuss issues of the day, and helped pass the Right Law, which was California's aid to prohibition in stopping the sale of alcohol in local markets and stores in their neighborhood.
Woe unto thee, Babylon, mighty city, for the day of thy fall is nigh.
Quoted Pastor Ryland from the pulpit as he recited the passage of Guinaud's Babylon's Wave in the days before the polls were to open, to remind the congregation of their commitment to help lead the community in the fight against the sale of liquor.
Vote no on number 9 and no on number 6 on the ballot at the next election. Do not be deceived by the wording of these measures, and so cast your ballot for the bootleggers. We must all be awake and working to keep the right law for law enforcement.
While the right law was defeated, the church in their spirit was not. Dr. Ryland, with the wholehearted support of the church, devoted himself to improving community conditions, including those at the city jail, to which the city council thanked him and his church. The Volunteers of America, the Mental Hygiene Commission, Playground Commission, the Travelers Aid Society, Social Services, Industrial Welfare Commission, and other organizations of community and city met at the church to help solve the problems and issues of the day at Mount Hollywood. Days which sadly still saw segregation in the city, but for which a colored day nursery was organized for children of the black families living in the area. School lunches and Christmas gifts were made and given to the immigrant Mexican children at the downtown Macy's Street School.
It was a privilege to expend so much time and energy.
Reported Reverend Ryland in the church newsletter.
The future of our church should be one of usefulness, which will be realized in a large measure only as we are capable of having the life of Christ reproduced in ourselves and our children and the members of our community. It would be in vain for us to do our work in any other spirit.
A spirit of service that sadly would be done without their beloved Pastor Ryland leading them, as he accepted a position as General Secretary of the Church Federation of Los Angeles and reconciliation with his Methodist Church.
But the relation of friend and counselor can never be terminated. Between the members of Mount Hollywood during your pastorate and this man, whom all love and revere.
Los Angeles County Supervisor and longtime congregation member John Anson Ford reminded the church and Reverend Ryland at a dinner held to both honor and bid goodbye to their beloved pastor. At a meeting of the church on Wednesday evening, September 1st, a unanimous call was extended to the Reverend Alan A. Hunter to become our pastor, his work with us to begin October 15th.
I believe the work of the pastor is to give not structure, but meaning to the church.
The Reverend Hunter stated in his inaugural speech to the congregation on January 1st, 1927. He also believed in social activism for peace and brotherhood in following the commandments of Christ, a belief by which both the pastor and his church would become quite well known. In 1928, A.J. Musty, a well-known Trotskyite and head of the Brook Labor College, was invited to speak at the church on the conditions of garment workers in what could best be described as a sweatshop, and more pointedly as criminal in the conditions in which they worked. Many in the church congregation came to hear him out of their concern for these people, mostly poor Mexican women working for as little as $4.50 a week for 55 hours. And by their need for economic and social justice, although the press, and in particular religious reporter Dan Thrapp of the Los Angeles Times, believed the pastor and the services and speakers to be little more than friends for Communist Party politics. But it was an affront to the church and Reverend Hunter that the Times didn't report the needs for social justice in the case of these garment workers, or the way in which they were brutally treated by the police department. Congregation member Adelia House, along with Reverend Hunter and other area Congregational churches, framed a petition that was endorsed by the Hollywood Ministerial Association and presented it to Mayor Porter to restrain Captain Hines of the police department from unnecessary brutality in dealing with the women on strike. The next day after they presented the petition, the church ministers were on hand to see that the police department of Los Angeles would protect and serve those protesting women in their peaceful demonstration for decent wages. Reverend Hunter also served notice on the Times to stop their slanderous libel in accusing him and his church of being a communist front, and charged religious reporter Dan Thrapp for not having done enough actual investigative journalism, or even using some simple intelligence to tell the difference between what was social activism or a communist cause, as Reverend Hunter and his church continued their policy to support and open up their sanctuary to all those who would wish to speak out against any social or moral ill. Sherwood Eddy, Howard Thurman, Gerald Hurd, author Aldous Huxley, Carrie McWilliams, head of Immigration and Housing Services for the state of California, came to speak out on the horrible state of migrant laborers. Ralph Bunche, later ambassador to the United Nations, came to speak on the white problem.
It takes very little conscience, I think, to know that prejudice and discrimination against one's fellow human because of race, or color or religion or national origin or cultural difference or sex are morally wrong.
The church also supported open debate and discussion on political issues and even worked on the election of author and novelist Upton Sinclair, a noted socialist, it was reported in the Times, for governor of California in 1934. His slogan was to end poverty in California. He said, "I believe in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, and I insist on seeing them tried."
I was running for governor of California on the ticket of the Democratic Party with a program to end poverty in California, and had a conference with Franklin Roosevelt, our great president, that lasted for 2 hours, and he talked out his heart to me and I talked out my heart to him. He said, "Mr. Sinclair, I can't go any faster than the people will let me." And that is the point. The people have to be educated. They have to learn by experience, perhaps by blundering. They can throw those candidates out of office and have a new election. And that is the basic principle on which we stand in America and by which we live.
The Muriel Lester Group of the Fellowship of Reconciliation at Church, along with Reverend Hunter, tried to organize a parade to shout out support for their candidate at the Shrine Auditorium, where Upton Sinclair was to debate Frank C. Merriam. But the police wouldn't permit it. So Reverend Hunter instead organized what he called a walking newspaper to silently carry along the sidewalk long streamers bearing slogans such as, "He who neglects the poor neglects God," to emphasize Upton Sinclair's position, much to the consternation of the committee who had organized the debate, when Sinclair's opponent Frank C. Merriam protested all the publicity that the banner-bearing marchers were making. Merriam won the political election, but the position of the poor, needy, and neglected people in California that the pastor and his church had demanded action for in Sinclair's campaign won the attention of the people, as well as the rising talk of war.
Last Midtime News. Washington. United States Admiralty of the National... The British Cabinet met in Tokyo. The military and civilian branches of the government...
We want no war. We'll have no war, save in defense of our own people or our own honor.
In November 1936, the American Institute of Public Opinion, known as the Gallup poll, asked a representative cross-section of American people, if another war develops in Europe, should America take part again? No. 95%.
The Reverend Hunter took on Rupert Hughes in a debate over the issue of, would I fight in any war declared by my government? Muriel Lester, founder of England's peace movement, Friends for Reconciliation, talked of peace, and the Reverend Toshio Kagawa, the Christian leader from Japan, who Allen had known since their days together at Princeton in 1915, came to talk of finding a greater understanding between America and Asia and against the rising militarism in his country. But also finding in this country that he wasn't allowed to use the YMCA bathroom or pool where he was an invited guest speaker because he wasn't white. Racism in this country wasn't so clearly defined into black and white issues, especially in Los Angeles. Mexicans, Asians, and any other ethnicity that clearly weren't Caucasian were looked upon with suspicion and mistrust.
The question confronting us at this time,
said the Reverend Hunter,
is not the academic one, are we all of one blood, but the practical one. How can we clear away the bad blood that is between us now? Can our generation look squarely and sensitively into the needs and capacities of races other than our own?
Asked the Reverend Hunter, questioning not only his congregation, but perhaps his own shortcomings as a man and minister. Mount Hollywood Congregational Church in 1930 was as clearly white on the outside as it was on the inside, with the majority of the congregation consisting of Caucasian members. But this was not from a purposeful segregation of the population found sadly in so many other houses of worship. Even as the members of Mount Hollywood and its pastor preached and acted out in protest and actions against inequality, they still had no black members in attendance at church, even though on the nearby street of Commonwealth was a small but well-established community of black families. A young boy named Alvin Gow, who attended Mount Hollywood regularly with his family, had a neighborhood friend named Purcell Brown Jr., whom he convinced one night to come and visit the boys' club the church had started at Mount Hollywood. The next night, Purcell convinced his younger brother, Wyndham, to come join him. In the next few weeks, and for as long as they lived in the area, the entire family of Purcell and Wyndham Brown could be seen sitting in the front row of Mount Hollywood Congregational Church. While they were welcomed at Mount Hollywood, there were still some members uneasy at the sight of Wyndham and Purcell dancing at the young people's church parties with white girls. As adults were still mindful of the public laws prohibiting the mixing of the races that were causing problems outside the church, that a young boy, much less a lot of the adults in the congregation, couldn't comprehend.
The county jail at St. Joseph, Missouri also was stormed by a mob, which overpowered sheriff's forces despite a heavy gas barrage to get at a Negro charged with criminal assault. They wrecked the steel door and the interior of the prison, and the Negro was lynched and his body burned. Governor Park of Missouri is enraged over the mob violence and says he'll bring the lynchers to justice. Oh, what a terrible week America has had.
While walking in Griffith Park on one of the many nature hikes that the pastor would take the youth groups on, he took Purcell and Wyndham aside to try and explain to the innocence of a child an adult's viewpoint on racial animosity and hatred.
Now, I just wanted to ask you if you're having fun at church.
Yes, Pastor Reverend Sir, we're having lots of fun.
What is it you're having fun doing at church?
Playing.
Praying? Well, young Wyndham, that's most admirable.
He means playing.
Oh. And?
And the dances, they're the most fun.
Well, at the dances, don't you think you'd have as much fun if you dance with someone more like yourselves?
You mean with other boys? I don't want to dance with no boys.
No, what I mean is that...
Purcell listened quietly to the pastor's patient explanation, and then kept on walking and dancing with whomever he would meet at church.
Hey, Purcell, look what I found! No, I found it! No, I found it!
Children! Never mind. You all just run off and have a good time. We of the churches deny everything Jesus stood for, unless we too stand by the disinherited, for whom he gave his life.
Allen wrote in a book dedicated to his own children entitled Acts of Faith.
But we must never deny our center of reference, which is God's love and truth. There is a show window aspect of the church for which the disinherited rightly have contempt. It sings and garbles brotherhood, at the same time without the honesty to placard the words on the front door. It sometimes acts on the assumption that one sees on the wall of certain restaurants that accept without discrimination the doctrine of discrimination. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone.
He spoke of a young black minister, a friend of Allen's, preaching before a service conducted by young white people at a so-called Christian church, who were happy to have that black minister there and break down the wall of segregation in their house of worship as he spoke before their youth conference.
That night, with the conference over, the young black minister came back to the church and sat in the back row of the same church to worship. The usher, not recognizing the minister from the morning services, escorted him outside, suggesting that he must be in the wrong church. It was the wrong church,
emphasized an adamant Reverend Hunter. And Mount Hollywood Congregational, he declared, was the right church for Wyndham and Purcell Brown to be in, to dance, walk, talk, and demonstrate a brotherhood in the name of Jesus with anyone they wanted to.
The real church, however invisible, is for all the hurt, all the exploited of the earth, with a caring that shuts out no one.
In the East, America still welcomed into this country the poor and tired, huddled masses of refugees and immigrants from Europe looking for a better life. But facing the Pacific, the state of California, and the United States government were shutting out any more Asians from entering the country, and especially the state, as California had the largest concentrated population of Asians anywhere outside of Asia itself, and also the largest number of racial incidents against them, fueled on in early lessons learned from school books, telling them of a golden horde threatening civilization, like a tidal wave, to help make the American imagination apprehensive about a future flood of yellow men, wrote Alan Hunter in his 1928 book, Facing the Pacific. Played upon by the journalists and politicians, he said, who didn't seem to want to discuss any other factors behind the fears that propagated such problems.
What should concern us now is not the rising tide of color, but of numbers. Man must limit his reproductive capacity, speed his food production, or exterminate his rivals. Just as we saw in the last Great War, when 10 million or more food consumers were put out of the way.
He believed in birth control and open discussions about sexuality, having studied the movement in America of the efforts led by Margaret Sanger in defiance of the law. For the pastor of Mount Hollywood Congregational passionately believed that an informed population is better than an overpopulating and ignorant one which spreads starvation and disease simply by the sheer number of people living on this planet. Such conditions that he saw in China only a year earlier in 1925, when he ministered the message of Jesus at the University of Nanking's Forestry and Agricultural School. Trying to plant the seeds of understanding with a teacher named Chow Ming Ai, who lectured on increasing their country's yield of cotton and rice, Allen would explain how decreasing the size of their population could result in a better educated and better fed China, and suggesting that population control is the will of God. But such suggestions did not sit well in a country whose leaders considered such preaching an attack on their racial identity and country from Caucasian evangelists who had come into China and exploited them with their talk of an obedience and trust in this love of Jesus. Whipping up their young students to save China by surrendering to the will of God, Allen recalled in writing his book, Youth's Adventure, where he advocated abstinence and birth control to stave off starvation and future conflict.
Without warning, Japan invaded Manchuria. Once again, men who were peaceful became the slaves of men who were violent.
Back in the United States, Reverend Hunter was warning in letters of outrage and protest to the mayor and governor of California the manner of racial hatred he saw, after witnessing, along with 2 members of the Congregation's college club, an attack and brutal beating of a Japanese man by the Los Angeles police who simply carried a sign stating, "Our children are starving," in a peaceful protest to call attention to the famine in the Far East and the refusal of the U.S. to help provide that relief. As public opinion against Japan and Japanese Americans began to grow.
On this 10th day of June, 1940, the hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor.
Hoping to help ease the growing tensions and mistrust between America and the Japanese people, Reverend Hunter, along with Reverend Tanemoto of the nearby Japanese Hollywood Independent Church, held worship services together to allay the growing fears and racial animosity in the area against those of Japanese ancestry.
We were born here. Our homes, our friends, our livelihood, our future are all deeply bound up with this native land of ours. We realize how fortunate we are to be living in this of all the lands of the earth, and we cherish our heritage as Americans.
Reverend Tanemoto prayed for the peace and understanding between all people, not just in America, but in the war-torn countries of Europe and Asia, as he gave his last sermon before the combined congregations before leaving to take up his new position as pastor of the Methodist Church in Hiroshima. In August of 1941, Reverend Hunter arranged to have his friend Toyohiko Kagawa come talk at his church, in what would be his final appearance in America, to speak of the sacrifice, compassion, and love that Christ had shown him in coming before the cross.
God reveals himself only when I will to love,
revealed the Reverend Kagawa, in recalling his imprisonment by the Imperial Army for preaching his love and commitment to Jesus, in a country where the way of the gods, a belief called Shintoism, was revered, and the emperor considered to be the descendant of God, not Jesus, and the people taught to fear even mentioning his name. And those who would follow in the way of the cross were jailed or executed.
Through crosses, we can learn nearness to God. Let Adam have a cross.
He prayed for the pastor and the church. He ended his prayer with a pointed question to the pastor and the congregation.
Are you willing to share Christ's cross on Calvary?
The prophetic question posed by Reverend Kagawa was answered all too soon on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. As a world at war weighed heavily upon them all.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
All civilian males aged 18 to 45 were ordered to report to selective service boards for physical examinations and classification. All businesses and even places of worship owned or run by Japanese Americans were ordered shut down and secured by the police until further notice. The President issued an Executive Order, number 9066, relieving the Attorney General of all responsibility and authority in the areas designated within, making Los Angeles and virtually all of the West Coast now a military zone, including the area where Mount Hollywood had so long stood for peace. The Reverend Hunter asked that all area ministers from both Japanese and American houses of worship come to this church to pray for guidance and light in the dark days that lay ahead. In early February of 1942, congregation member Ray Kenny came with Reverend Hunter to the Japanese Independent Church of Hollywood to meet with their new minister, Reverend Royden Susumago, to talk to him and his congregation of how they could help keep Hollywood Independent open and active as a church, if the impending rumors of the relocation of all Japanese American citizens came to be true. At a hastily called congregational meeting on April 12, 1942, Dr. Jesse L. Moraine, an attorney and member of Mount Hollywood, came before the pulpit to read the following resolution drafted from the earlier meeting with the Japanese Independent Church. It read that the Mount Hollywood Congregational Church empower and authorize the Board of Trustees to accept and act under the power of attorney given and granted to them by the Japanese Independent Church of Hollywood for the title, trust, and care of their small church. The motion was carried unanimously by a voice vote of all in the congregation at Mount Hollywood. On the morning of May 3rd, 1942, Los Angeles and everyone living in cities along the West Coast awoke to the news from handbills printed and posted along city streets, announcing that all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the designated areas were ordered to report for evacuation to so-called relocation camps for their safety and security of the United States in this time of national emergency.
What has actually been worked out is a policy of concentration camps,
replied the writer of a letter to Secretary of War Stimson, who responded to another letter written by a member of the church-affiliated group based in New York, called the Post-War World Council, in asking for the President to clarify the policies of forcing Japanese American citizens from their homes, churches, and businesses.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our West Coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move,
leaving behind as many personal possessions that could be crammed into the space of the basements of Mount Hollywood and the Japanese Independent Church. The congregations of both churches bid a tearful goodbye to each other, as families, women, and children boarded buses to take them to the camps under armed guard, leaving behind their small church to the care of Mount Hollywood, and leading one sergeant assisting in the evacuation who recognized Reverend Hunter to remark,
"Boy, you sure like them Japs, don't you?"
When those Japs were finally taken away from Los Angeles and the West Coast after Pearl Harbor. Another congregation member was confronted with even more inflammatory remarks, comments, and rumors made against the Japanese. As he collected information for a report to the Congressional Inquiry on the situation of the Japanese on the Pacific Coast, a factual study of the events. Dr. George Gleason was appointed by the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors to head up the Los Angeles County Committee on Church and Community Cooperation, and a longtime member of Mount Hollywood Congregational Church. To submit such a report containing a factual study of the events surrounding the Japanese community, Dr. Gleason felt would do much to help hold down the racial hatred that was spreading against a group of people who had shown only loyalty to this country. As he reported to the Tolan Committee on March 3, 1942.
The sudden removal from their homes and places of businesses on the Pacific coast of 109,000 Japanese, two-thirds of them American citizens, is an event of major importance in American history. A review of the events of the past 9 months is needed because opinions of people have become prejudiced, both regarding the loyalty of the Japanese and concerning the attitude of the American public toward the Japanese.
Attitudes, which ranged from an effort in the Colorado State Legislature, which had at first welcomed the Japanese to relocate there away from the coast, to now prevent them from buying even 1 foot of land in the state. As rumors spread about the evacuees buying up all available property in the state, to outright murders and assassination attempts against Japanese Americans. Reports of 10 truckloads of ammunition being taken from the Japanese church on Normandy Avenue in Los Angeles were denied as unfounded by Chief C.B. Harrell of the Los Angeles Police Department, who reported that, "We have no knowledge of any ammunition taken from any church." Notwithstanding any rumors of sabotage, Attorney General Biddle announced on July 4, 1942, that although the FBI had arrested a total of 9,405 alleged disloyal aliens, including 4,764 Japanese, there has not been perpetrated to date a single large-scale act of sabotage. Dr. Gleason concluded his report to the Tolan Committee with the fact that,
"When the war is over, there will remain in the continental United States, according to the 1940 federal census, 126,947 people of Japanese ancestry. Friends of this large group should at once begin to study and plan for a solution of the problems of continued support by the denominations of their Japanese churches, and the greater absorption of Japanese Christians into American churches."
By our love. to the Spirit.